This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. It's episode 490 of the Craft Beer and Brewing podcast, and this is the America 250 episode. It's July 3rd. So I figured, we've got this 250 years of the U.S. History, and we should do an episode that talks about those early days of American brewing. So joining me are Mike Stein. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks so much for having us, Jamie.
And also Pete Jones. Welcome, Pete.
Thank you so much.
The project that you all work on together is called Lost Loggers, and obviously Mike has contributed to Craft Beer and Brewing in various forms a number of times. The work that you guys have been doing in the historical brewing world is pretty cool. You work on a number of different projects, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that process of historical recreation. We're going to talk about what brewing looked like at America's founding 250 years ago. Quite a bit different than it looks now, but then in some ways maybe not as different. There's a through line through all of that. We're going to talk about that process of doing the historical work to find that information. We're also going to talk about what ingredients looked like, how you think about modern corollaries for those ingredients and make beers that then connect back to that history, but are still compelling and drinkable for today's audiences because, beers you make have to be both of those things. We're going to talk about all of that, but first...
Hey there, Justin from G&D Chillers. Sustainability isn't just a buzzword, it's a necessity for breweries today. That's why we've engineered solutions like the Elite 290 Micro Series, running on natural refrigerants with near zero GWP.
That's right, G&D's new Elite 290 Micro Series is built for brewers who care about sustainability and performance. It runs on a natural refrigerant with near zero global warming potential, has a compact footprint, and features variable speed fans for efficiency. They've chilled beer for over 3,000 breweries across North America, and with 24/7 support and remote monitoring, your cold side stays dialed in day or night. Get the details on natural refrigerant technology at gdchillers.com/podcast. And it's here. Berkeley's Fresh Chico is now available dry. You've heard here on the podcast just how many medal-winning brewers use Fresh Chico as their house strain because of how clean and versatile it is. If you want to make a world-class IPA, your fermentation must avoid unwanted or distracting flavors. And Berkeley's robust low-diacetyl technology is a game-changer with healthy and highly viable cells that ferment fast and clean every time. Bringing that level of fermentation innovation to dried yeast is no small feat, but the experts at Berkeley Yeast love making the impossible possible. With bricks priced as low as $88, it's a cost-effective solution, and you'll save even more by eliminating ALDC from your brews. Head over to berkeleyyeast.com and start leveling up your IPA today. Also, this episode is sponsored by PackTech, delivering craft beer multi-packing you can trust. PackTech's handles are made from 100% recycled plastic and are fully recyclable, helping breweries close the loop and advance the circular economy. With a minimalist design, durable functionality you can rely on, and custom color matching, PackTech helps brands stand out while staying sustainable. Trusted by craft brewers nationwide, they offer a smarter, sustainable way to carry your beer. To learn more, visit packtech-opi.com. That's PAKTECH-OPI.com. We normally start off with a little bit of history, and this whole entire episode is going to be about history in one way or another. But why don't you start us off, Pete? Why don't you give us a little bit of your history and lead us down this road, and what got you interested in pursuing this kind of historical approach to brewing?
Sure. Thanks, Jamie. So Mike and I met, I think it was around 2013, and we were both part of the DC Homebrewers Club. So we obviously big, passionate homebrewers. But prior to that, I went to graduate school for history, and I've been a professional historian for over 15 years. My firm does a lot of environmental history that supports litigation. We do a lot of Native American history that also supports litigation, working for the Department of Interior or other government agencies here in Washington, D.C., where Mike and I are Washington, D.C. area where Mike and I are both based. And so I had kind of these dual interests of history and homebrewing. And so, getting to combine them was really kind of a dream. Making really when we started, we were just making historical recipes at the homebrew scale, Papazian's Sumerian beer and some of those kind of old chestnuts. And then we also really delved into the history of Washington, D.C.'s pre-Prohibition breweries. And that might be a good place to let Mike take it over.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. So yeah, in common craft brewing fashion, we started out as home brewers. But as Pete mentioned, in 2013, I had graduated from George Mason University with my Master of Fine Arts in creative nonfiction. And where I was really interested in storytelling, who the brewers were 200 years ago, what their lives were like. Meeting Pete was like, well, there's archives, you can actually go read what George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, or James Hemings, right? Like, I think once we got into what are the primary sources and how do we explore them, that really was the birth of Lost Lagers. And I should say the caveat to Lost Lagers is we are Lost Lagers, DC's premier beverage research firm, but we also dabble in extinct ales. And actually a lot of the beers we brew today are extinct ales. Although Lost Lagers is how we started and that's our passion. But yeah, transitioning from home brewing into commercial beer, Pete and I were lucky enough to find some folks in the DC metro area. And then a bit further south of DC, we have, of course, Colonial Williamsburg and Jamestown and all of these sites that really are even prior to 1776. We think about 1619 as this incredibly important year in Virginia history and by default national history. And it so happens that most recently our beers have come out of Dynasty Brewing Company. And Dynasty's name actually comes from the first several presidents being from Virginia and the Virginia dynasty, as it were, in the presidency and presidential history.
So tell me about 1619. What made it such a pivotal year, and for Virginia history, and then kind of map out what life and brewing looked like in that era of very, very like pre-U.S. American history.
Well, I should say, Jamie, you asked us to do 18th and 19th century. And so all of my notes were, just to be clear, because I realize it's a brewing audience, but I, as a person with a learning disability, I have dysgraphia, I should lay out. 18th century means 1700s, right. 19th century means 1800s. But because it's you and craft beer and brewing, we'll give you the 17th century, which is 1600s. So 1619 is the arrival of the first ship in Virginia. There are colonists, there are enslaved Africans, all coming to Virginia. And in terms of beer production back then, it's kind of hard to stretch our mind back this far, but if we can, we know that beer and ale are very different. Of course, the tendency in 2026 is to think, oh, well, we have porter then, and porter was around in the 1700s, so it's a 1-to-1. And of course the world looked entirely different, everything was different, so we have to kind of do away with that. That being said,
those of us who've watched IPA and what IPA means in 2026, which is generally often sweet and fruity, versus what IPA was even 15 years ago, can understand this kind of like what this historical arc might look like now if you stretch it back 400 years and not just the past 15.
100%. And I think the important thing to realize then, or now to apply then, stretch your mind back 26 years. Think about the year 2000, right? Hazy New England aromatic IPA wasn't really around the way it is today. If we go back even further and think of the sea change of Brettanomyces in IPA, it would be atypical of me to walk into a tasting room today and expect Brett in an IPA. But of course, several hundred years ago, there may have been a sea change where more IPAs had Brett on the market than those that didn't, right? We're really thinking about 1900 when Brett begins to be isolated and understand, the British fungus, Brettanomyces, what it is. So there's been a sea change many times over since 1619. But I'll ask Pete, what do you think is important about that year and highlighting for the modern brewers listening?
So one thing that I think we really like to highlight is the diversity of experiences that go into sort of brewing knowledge. And as Mike mentioned, this is sort of the beginning of African slavery in the United States. And as part of our project with Dynasty Brewing in Mount Vernon, George Washington's home in Virginia, we have found that the enslaved that worked at Mount Vernon really had a big impact in the sorts of brewing activities that they were doing at Mount Vernon. For example, Lund Washington, who was George Washington's cousin, while George was actually fighting in the Revolutionary War, Lund was was managing Mount Vernon. And he came up with this idea to make persimmon beer or persimmon spirits. Actually, he was eventually thinking of making. He only got as far as making persimmon beer, persimmon wine, but we believe that was really inspired by persimmon beer wine that enslaved people at Mount Vernon were making kind of for their own households. Persimmons seeds were one of the most frequently found organic matter that was in the enslaved quarters at Mount Vernon. So you can see the direct line from what the enslaved were doing at Mount Vernon for their own households, and then what Lund Washington was trying to commercialize as a commercial product. So I think that's an example of how these diversity of brewing experiences really makes the world of brewing a much wider place. So I think that's a big part of why 1619 was an important date for us to discuss here.
Sure. Mike, what's you mentioned there's a difference between beer and ale. What would that difference have been in the 1600s and into the 1700s?
Well, the big one everybody thinks about, and rightfully so, is hops. Of course, we're thinking about England. Beer and ale are sold side by side together, one with hops, one without, or one with a perceivable bitterness contributed by hops, one with different bitterness or a bitterness thanks to another botanical. But what I think is even more interesting in regards to U.S. history is with a beer like persimmon beer that Peter outlined, that's a beer that can be made solely with fruit, with no barley. And I think you would be hard pressed to find a beer today that was brewed without, if not mashing in malted barley, malt extract or malt syrup, right? Like, we consider barley as a key ingredient to beer. Of course, there's wheat beer and rye beer and all other grains, but there's a wonderful historian named Michael Twitty, and he provides a sort of, jumping ahead to the 19th century, a Civil War era recipe for persimmon beer, which is just persimmon, water, yeast, honey, locust pods, and pine needles. So there's not one barley corn and not one hop cone in it. And that is really kind of counterintuitive. When we hear beer, we're like, what? No barley, no malt? But that, again, the rules of the past don't conform to our norms today. And so it's really important to think of something persimmon beer. You might even consider more like cider or more like wine, even though in the records, to Pete's point about Lund Washington, George's cousin, who was managing Mount Vernon, he said, making persimmon beer today, I know they make a fine spirit, but basically I didn't have any time to distill it, so I just made beer. And we do know that the enslaved distillers at Mount Vernon were making a good bit of whiskey by Mount Vernon's guess, 11,000 gallons in the 1790s, not too long before George Washington dies in 1799. But back to the beer and ale thing, those really kind of went head to head, they both were sold. And what's interesting about George in this time period in the 18th century is he was importing a good bit of beer from England and then finally decided, can't import beer anymore, but I'll leave that up to Pete to tell that story.
Sure. So, yeah, I think this is another part of our Mount Vernon project that I think we're very proud of is George Washington famously signed an agreement with other Virginia merchants. This is way before the Declaration of Independence. This is 1770. He agrees with other merchants and politicians in Virginia that they will no longer import many items from England. And, top of the items of they are no longer going to import are porter, beer, malt, all these beer-centric ingredients. And actually in that same year, I think not surprisingly, Washington, D.C. gets its very first commercial brewer, a man by the name of Andrew Wales, who does also sell his beer to George Washington. Also, it's such a weird time in the 1770s. Andrew Wales is a Scotsman who's been brewing in Virginia for many, many years before he starts his own brewery. He'd been brewing at a plantation, but he was actually a big Tory. So in 1776, Andrew Wales is selling his beer to George Washington, but he is a supporter of the king. So, it's hard to imagine that kind of activity and today, but it was truly a very crazy time in America, and that's in the 1770s.
Sure. And interesting to think that beer and beer ingredients played a significant commercial role in the entire politics of the time, and thinking about the kind of trade issues that formed some of the core of the colonies' objections to England. Interesting. And obviously temperature control at that time was an incredibly challenging thing, and you had ice, and that's basically all you had, and blocks of ice, and some methods for keeping things cold. But keeping beer cold was probably not a primary concern for a lot of folks those days. And of course, yeast and the culture that was doing the fermentation wouldn't be identified, for another 60, 70 years after that. And, and so there was a lot going on there that was still a little bit magical.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think that's a great jumping off point to the different place that beer held in the 18th century America, because, the beer that we remade for Mount Vernon is a middling ale. So that's one that would be like a little bit more of a posh beer for the time period. There's also strong ale, kind of like or October beer, kind of like our barley wine. But on a day-to-day basis, people are drinking tons and tons of small beer or table beer. And it's not to get drunk. This is like a 2% or so beer. It's really for the calories that it's provided in for, the work that they're doing every day. People's diet was, 50% beer as far as like where they're getting their calories. So it's just a very important part of turning an agricultural product, barley or wheat or any of other cereal grains, into something that's more stable as far as not spoiling, and B, a clean water source. So the water at the time was very likely to make you sick because they didn't have as much of an understanding of the basic hygiene. Especially in Virginia, a lot of the rivers, the Jamestown area, are tidal, and so the salt content will go up and down, and at certain times of the year, it can be essentially poison to people to drink that water, as opposed to drinking a freshwater source that's then brewed, boiled, and part of making beer. So it was a big part of people's calorie diet and also keeping healthy.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing when you look at that human history, the amount of that fermentation, the role that fermentation in general has played in terms of like preserving those resources. Like we have cheese through fermentation because, milk will spoil, but with the right culture, you can turn that milk that is prone to spoiling, and also, by extension, the fields of wildflowers and wild grasses and summer sunshine, and you can turn all of those resources into this, like, cheese as a battery of sorts that is holding this, these calories and this kind of product that is then stable for 6 months or a year or 2 years, and gets you through those kinds of that winter time where you don't have access to those same kinds of things. You have less sun, you have less wildflowers. Your cows are still producing milk. You can still make that winter cheese, but and beer fermentation is that same kind of thing. You take this summer crop, of barley or grain of whatever they're growing, wheat, and then can turn it into something that then can provide calories, in that kind of off season for these, and in an era where calories were harder to come by and more resource intensive to come by, that's an important function.
Yeah, 100%. I think we have to put the 18th century in context of the complete opposite of our dietary concerns. I myself am a type 1 diabetic, so I'm counting carbs, fat every day. Whereas, it's more likely you were struggling to get the calories you needed comparatively to today, where you could hit 2 meals and be way over, 3,000 calories if you really needed to. But to your point about storage, things growing long, this is part of the reason Mount Vernon is sort of an epic distillery in those early days. Because wheat actually grows at Mount Vernon, as does rye, whereas barley didn't. George Washington tried to grow it a few seasons in a row, and it just never took. So part of the reason we brew George Washington Mount Vernon's Virginia Porter with Virginia barley and Virginia malted is to sort of make good on that desire of eventually making a Virginia grown malted product. And I should probably back up here and say, Pete and I have been working to make beers for Mount Vernon for the last 5 years. We started in 2021. And the first beer that we brewed was Virginia Porter. And then thanks to the distillery at Mount Vernon, we had rye cask-aged Virginia Porter. So that felt pretty good. And I can't remember if Sierra Nevada's first beer was porter or stout. But as all the brewers listening will know, it's much better to brew a stout or porter because they tend to be more forgiving than the delicate Helles Pils or leaked beer or something, brewing a small pale lager. But yeah, that's a bit of context on the Mount Vernon beers.
Sure. Well, let's talk about some of the kind of historical work and recreation, and what you have found in those archives, that shares some of that approach and information about brewing. Let's talk a little bit about that. But first, Oregon hop country is heaven to world-class lager varieties, and Indie Hops is proud to have introduced Oregon's newest lager hop, Lorien, in 2022. Lorien is in a growing list of beers that have found their way to the podium and, more importantly, into the hearts of lager lovers across the country. Discover Indie Hops Lorien. Side effects may include rampant festivity, sales bumps, and exceeded expectations. Indie Hops, life is short. Let's make it flavorful. And this podcast is sponsored by the Midea 5050 Flex, the industry's first dual compartment, 3-way convertible freezer. The 5050 Flex is designed to flex with your life. It can convert to all fridge, all freezer, or half and half with just the touch of a button. Plus, with reversible doors and adjustable storage compartments, you can stay organized no matter your food storage needs. The 5050 Flex is also designed to maintain a stable temperature, even in non-climate controlled spaces, so it's perfect for your garage, man cave, or wherever you need a little more space. Maybe use all 20 cubic feet as a beer fridge. Check out midea.com/US for more information on how to take your beer storage to the next level. So, Pete, you're the professional historian, and I love that you were a private practice historian, not locked in academia per se, but you found a commercial practice for history. Talk about some of that method of discovery to go dig in and understand how they were brewing at Mount Vernon in that late 1700s and early 1800s.
Yeah, so I think a lot of our research is really driven in some ways by serendipity. We'll come across a document or just see a story and then kind of dig deeper into that And so in this case, we've been doing some of this work for Mount Vernon and some of these other beers. And we came across, or we actually were having lunch at Mount Vernon's restaurant with their director of the project that we're working on. Their director of we sell our beer through the gift shop. So she had taken us out for lunch there, and I saw that a lot of the meals at Mount Vernon, the dishes were based off of a cookbook that Martha Washington once owned, and so kind of went into the historical version of that book and a cookbook, which was the Art of Cookery by Hannah Glass. And she actually had a page on brewing. And so that kind of became the impetus for us brewing these 250 anniversary beers. Martha and the enslaved people in the kitchen at Mount Vernon were very likely the ones that were brewing these beers. And so, the brewing page was very interesting to kind of look at that. And the different ingredients were not measured in pounds and gallons. They were actually measured in quarters and hogsheads. So we had to do some additional digging to figure out, what are the equivalents of these 18th century units of measure. So it's a lot of just little trails like that where we find one thing and we'll search the archives or libraries for another aspect and just have to kind of piece everything together.
Yeah, it's definitely a hodgepodge. I say that because I'm jealous of what archives in other countries look like. It's not a distinctive American problem. Of course, there are many other countries that have things scattershot all throughout the country. But for example, my father was born in Prague, and when we were doing research, we went to Národní archivu, the Czech National Archives, and everything was there. Like I could see my grandfather's parking ticket from 1915. Like it was all in one file, concentrated, like the police file. It's a little more challenging with that, where this text that Martha owned was actually a gift to her from her mother-in-law. And I forget if it's Penn State or University of Pennsylvania that holds the physical copy of Hannah Glass's book. But Pete was lucky when he found, peanut soup at the Mount Vernon Tavern. Like, oh, that's a Hannah Glass recipe. Let's go check it out. So we go, and then we find it. And the irony about Hannah Glass is she has her page called Rules for Brewing. And the recipe that we used is really from this Rules for Brewing, where 3 beers are outlined: small beer, middling beer, and strong October beer. So, strong October beer, you could kind of consider the great grandmother of barley wine, middling, maybe pale ale or pale lager, and then small beer like table beer. But that recipe, even though it's Rules for Brewing, was published 1747. So this is 10 years before George Washington's recipe to make small beer is published. Well, that totally put George's small script, literally sketched in his notebook, into context to make small beer. Well, that's the smallest one. And you can do it from 1 guile, where you run off and have strong beer and weak beer after, or you can just use molasses to fortify that. George's recipe is in the New York Public Library. So it's interesting that even though George and Martha were married, her cookbook's in Pennsylvania, his cookbook's in Manhattan, and we're in Virginia kind of piecing it all together. It feels appropriate at the same time for a sort of fledgling country that was just English colonies a couple hundred years ago.
Sure.
Yeah, I'd say Google Books, I will have to admit, is really a godsend for beer historians, since so much of the material that is pre-prohibition is now in the public domain. All of these, brewer textbooks and advertisements and all sorts of really helpful information for what we do is all at the internet. But we do have to go into the stacks, into the archives for some material as well.
Let's talk about some of that early brewing process. If you're making a middling beer, since you all have now, tried to make a modern corollary to this middling beer to, again, celebrate this America 250 with Mount Vernon. The process at the time, we're not talking about modified malt at all. We are even a malting process. For ingredients, if they're growing them there in that area and they don't have barley, just walk through some of the the concerns as they would have been producing at the time, and then how you thought about updating those ingredients and processes to the modern era.
Sure. One difference, I think it's important to know, if you are a modern brewer, your audience. Who are you selling beer to, and which beer is going to be way too far out on a limb to not have it sit in your tap room for 6, 12, 18 months, right? That being said, in Hannah Glass's recipe, rules for brewing that we made the middling beer from, one of her first lines is, let your malt set, mill it, make sure it's super clean, and mill it and wait 4 to 5 days. And Pete and I were like, we are not milling our barleys 5 days before we brew. No way. There's just no way in hell we're doing that. And then ironically enough, we found a text from the Ohio company, which George Washington was one of the sort of speculators in the many land grabs in America. This land grab had another Virginia plantation owner who was a brewer. And this guy said,
damn developers have been a part of American history from before it was America.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
Well, it's ironic because many of the problems from the 18th century are still here today. But he says, I finally got rollers imported from England, and now I can mill in the morning of my brew. And so there's what the recipe says, what Martha Washington's cookbook says, which is mill in 4 or 5 days later brew, versus what was actually done from another, landed noble gentry enslaver in Virginia down the road from Washington, who, that book is more obscure because it's his notes from the Ohio company. And we were like, smoking gun. Some people didn't wait 5 days before they brewed,
Why would they have waited 5 days? I mean, is there a bacterial component to that, or I'm curious.
The presumption is cleanliness. When you read rules for brewing, it's like, clean your mash tubs. Don't use your tubs for anything except winemaking, right? It's like, don't use it for cheese making. Don't use it for butchering. Like, cleanliness is, we presume cleanliness. One aside I'll say about malt, which is really good. Several years ago, there was a beer history conference at Colonial Williamsburg, and the Valley Malt folks, so Valley Malt is run out of Massachusetts, Andrea and Christian Stanley, they're wonderful people. Andrea brought some source text to the conference, and she was like, Mike, do you know what they did in the 18th century to clean malt that had bugs or louts or maggots on it? And I said, no. And she's like, well, check out this text. And the text reads, first, set your lobsters upon your malt. I was like, oh my God, Andrea, this is crazy. So there's so much beer history that's left out on purpose. And I have to say, when you're considering that for your 21st century customer base, be kind to them, right?
No lobsters in the malt house.
Sounds kind of delicious to me. I don't know.
But yeah, I think it's important that, like Mike says, when we work with a brewer, we kind of meet them where they're at. And some brewers are more willing to work with more traditional techniques or more traditional ingredients. And, others wanted to go more modern. And that's totally legit. We kind of work with brewers on each project and where they're at. And so Andrea at Valley Malt, for example, once did brew us or malt us a very, very, malt over a campfire that was turned overnight in a very traditional way. And so we actually did brew a beer using that kind of malt. And it was really interesting to work with that, where it's totally inconsistent. Each kernel could be like pale and another kernel could be black. And the beer it made was, essentially porter colored, which, so that was kind of interesting to see that inconsistency still turned out a consistent product. With this beer, we wanted to kind of approximate some of the traditional caramelization process that, would have been more inconsistent by using pale malt, mostly pale malt, but including melanoid and malt. So that kind of gave it a little bit more color, a little bit of that caramelization for the beer Common Country that we brewed with Chili Hollow and Dynasty for Mount Vernon. And we've similarly used melanoid and malt in some of our 19th century lagers, historical pre-prohibition lagers and bocks. To, I think, pretty good effect.
How would they? They're going to be using probably a copper vessel over direct fire heat, for that mash back in that kind of historical context. Talk to me about what because I imagine some of those artifacts still probably exist unless they were melted down for other metallic uses.
Sure. I think the notion of pale beer as pale as we can make it today is kind of hard to come by the further back you go, even though, statistically speaking, a pale ale existed in the 18th century. Certainly not, you've got some wonderful maltsters that listen to the pod or support CB&B, and it's like sub 3 SRM, 1.8 SRM. Like there's no way that was around then. I'll share one tidbit.
It wasn't all smoky. We should still put that outside.
Correct.
I know there's this idea, all malt was smoky.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
But,
I don't know if Andreas Krenmeier has ever been on the pod, but I know he's written for the magazine. He's the author of Brewing Vienna Lager and Historic German Beers. He's just about to come out with, or has just released a book on Weiss beer, Hefeweizen, and there's a recipe for how to make wind malt at home, right? And that is the big, but, with all malt was smoky. But I will share one apocryphal story, which is great to think about. The Liberty Bell, which I don't know if you saw it during the Craft Brewers Conference, but, famously, it's a bell. It has a crack in it, and it's a symbol of liberty. It's the Liberty Bell. So there's a story that Pete and I found with some archival material from the Master Brewers Association of America, MBAA, friend to brewers, the country over and the world. So we're in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, and we found this pamphlet from the World's Fair, 1937. And it says, "Was Liberty Bell first brew kettle in Philadelphia?" ? And it was like, okay, so this thing is not about 90 years old, but how long had it been in popular lore before 1937 when they published it? Right. And it's like, yeah, maybe they really did hide the Liberty Bell, but there's no way in hell they were feeding fire and coal on, it's like, but it's such a great story, right? It's like, oh, sure. Well, the Hessians were there and the Moravians were in Philadelphia. So why wouldn't they use the Liberty Bell as a kettle? It's like,
I tell you, when you get into 1800s, 19th century beer marketing, from that 1860s to 1890s kind of period, it's fucking insane what the kind of stories that they were telling about, some of these origins. Like, it's easily debunked by folks that look at it now. But the marketers have been lying about beer history from the very earliest days of industrial beer. And, and so we can just view this as a long tradition of lying about that kind of history. But no, that's kind of funny.
But I think, Jamie, you're onto something with the long tradition. Pete and I have a friend, his name's Travis Rupp. He's the beer archaeologist. He teaches at UC Boulder, I think. But Travis had done a great bit of research on ancient Sumerian, Mesopotamian, Near East beer. And we kind of asked him, do you think that persimmon beer or George Washington small beer is a relative of these ancient Persian or Near Eastern beers? And he said, yeah, it's camp beer. Your army's in town, you set up shop, a week later, you got to go, 5 days in a whack, you're done. That's pretty much George Washington's recipe for small beer. So in a sense, there really is an ancient tradition that's kept alive, even though obviously persimmons are not, the Diospyros virginiana, since we're nerding out about it, is the native, North American persimmon, which goes all the way down to Mexico and goes all the way north past us in Virginia, pretty far north. So that's a good fermentable for, a beer that existed far before 1619, potentially.
And the principle exists that people were making beer everywhere in the world with the ingredients that they had at their fingertips. And, primarily because, making beer is a natural process and it just happens with those things. And it's something that humans figured out, tens of thousands of years ago. And that development of beer goes along with the development of humanity, period. And I won't go down on that rabbit hole, but read Ted Slingerland's book, Drunk, if you want a really excellent primer on this kind of role that beer has played in the evolution of Homo sapiens sapiens. And I think it's hard to kind of pull the two apart, that it's a wonderful technology that we've developed that has helped and aided the actual evolution of humanity. And I love that whole point. Nonetheless, but here you go, you are, no matter where people are in the world, they're using those ingredients. And so with North America, the ingredients that were growing natively in North America instantly became something that people looked to ferment to make these kinds of things. And then, of course, the grain that could grow in North America started becoming the thing that people made beer with because it grew well. So you said rye, was a component of those early beers, and of course wheat. Was there anything to that in particular, or obviously we're not going to have like details about protein levels and and all these other kinds of pieces that a modern brewer might want to pull apart there. But, at the same time, I'm sure there's somebody who's got some heirloom grains, hanging around, or that has maintained some older historical varieties that give you some clues into what some of those early grains might have been like.
Yeah. So Washington famously in his journal wrote that barley won't grow. He talks to his brewer, this guy, Andrew Wales, and is looking for barleys. Tries planting them, don't grow. Tries again, to no result. Wheat does grow, and even though Washington famously writes this recipe for small beer in 1757, outside of molasses, one of the key ingredients is bran. And Pete and I have had long back and forth with other beer historians and academics writ large about what bran is. To my knowledge, there's only one brewer brewing with bran today. It's a byproduct of wheat, and they're in Virginia. They happen to be in Virginia. So I asked him about bran, and he wrote to tell me, from my own experience, it's cheap, easy to use, and has a bigger flavor contribution than malted wheat. Definitely something I might start using more often. He said he purchased it from a miller, but commercially he's found a few sources that would put it much cheaper than other wheat products like flaked or torrefied wheat. And so it's really fascinating to me that it's not fully an extinct ale. He just made a small beer for the 250th with this. I haven't tried it yet. I'm very, very eager to try it. So wheat is a really interesting one. And I think via DC Homebrewers, we've had some fun playing around. Some folks have brewed a 85% wheated lager, 95%, 100% wheated lager. And the final product has been surprisingly, I think you could trick certainly the average consumer who doesn't give a shit about beer, who thinks all pale beer is beer. You could trick them into thinking that was a barley beer. So there is something to be said for wheat. Molasses is a tough one. You got to get unsulfured molasses. And then historically, how accurate do you want to get? As you said at the top, Jamie, it's not like a 1-to-1. Oh, porter malt, I'll just go get some porter malt. Pete had mentioned Andrea Stanley from Valley Malt had to make that for us. And Ron Pattinson, who was working on another historic porter at the time. But I think the timeline to produce a beer went into the marketing of it. So George Washington is actually paying more for fine old London porter than just straight up London porter. So you're actually, in the 18th century, he was paying more for an aged product. So even back then, there was some upcharge that a brewery had to offset the cost of production. He was getting kegs or, casks, barrels from a London wine merchant. But one thing Pete and I really want to encourage brewers who want to dig into the history bag is to make it your own. If you have a local maltster, that's a great place to start. It kind of reminds me some of the conversations about masa and Oaxacan green corn. There's a great brewer in Chicago, Jacob Sombrano, and he's done this deep dive into, Mexican corn varieties and masa making, and how it's like, you don't have to grow corn. You don't have to be a masa maker. Go talk to your local, person who's doing it, because they've already got the drop. So you might as well take advantage of their expertise. I think it's the same way with your local ingredients. That has a historical legacy to be upheld.
Cool. Well, let's trace then, what some of that transition from that founding of America, the United States, not founding America, founding of the United States, and those earlier days of Mount Vernon, then how that started to transition through the early 19th century, the early 1800s, and what some of those kinds of like pivotal moments of change in the early days of brewing in the now forming United States, what that looked like. Because I think that time in the early 1800s, you start thinking about what's happening in Europe, and you have this kind of, you have in the 1840s, Joseph Grohl and this whole, pale lager movement starting that very rapidly hit the United States within 10 or 15 years of it happening. So this was a early industrial revolution, a time of rapid development and change, and things went from very primitive, I wouldn't say totally primitive, but they went from very like localized on estates to being more business focused. And it was, some of those were interesting kinds of industrial shifts, that started to happen. And so I would love to track out some of those brewing milestones as you all have seen them. Before we do that, Briess Malting has been supplying craft brewers with the highest quality base and specialty malts since the early 1980s. As Briess celebrates their 150th anniversary this year, they're proud to remain a fifth-generation family-owned company. They love to support the creativity and passion in craft brewing that results in amazing beers. All Briess malts are made in America, so you can count on a reliable supply chain. Barley is sourced from 300 growers in the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming and Montana, plus technical support is available through their Center of Malting Excellence. With 150 years of malting expertise, check out why so many craft brewers trust Briess for their specialty malt at brewingwithbriess.com. Also, brewing has always been about creativity, but at scale, it's about control. For more than 100 years, Haas has worked with brewers to push what's possible with hops, and today that means more control over flavor, efficiency, and consistency. Their advanced products help you get more out of every brew, more flavor where you want it, less waste in the process, faster tank turns, and results you can count on batch after batch, year after year. From next-generation pellets like Lupocore and Lupamax to innovations like Incognito and Euphorix, Haas products fit seamlessly into your process, from the hot side through fermentation to the cold side. Advanced hop products are just one of the ways Haas is growing the future of brewing. Learn more at johnihaas.com. So for you guys, what then as brewing starts to progress from that 1757 hand scratched recipe, through this Revolutionary War period into these early days of what is now the United States of America, are there some milestones that you all have kind of outlined where things started taking some significant shifts?
Yeah,
definitely. So I think you hit the nail on the head when you said industrial milestones, because before the American Revolution, we're really talking about a world where beer, in America at least, is made primarily in the house. And then after the Revolution, we are shifting to a world where beer is made by men in factories. Obviously, in England, this predates American brewing industry. But American Revolution, we have the first brewery in Washington, D.C. is right before that. It's actually in Alexandria, Virginia, which was then part of Washington, D.C. But then we have kind of a little bit of a nadir in American brewing, as whiskey is really the drink of choice, the intoxicant of choice. Muddy, small beer is not as appealing as corn whiskey, it turns out. But then we have the revolutions of 1848 in Europe and the Pilsner Revolution. And that really does change American brewing for the next century. And that is the lager revolution, of course. So we have all of these German and Czech immigrants that are coming to the United States. They're founding breweries in their immigrant neighborhoods. They're bringing their practices and ingredients and yeast to America, using sometimes American ingredients to sort of create something that approximates Czech Pilsner, but in a totally different process and ingredient fashion, using corn, rice, mixed with 6-row malt as opposed to the 2-row malt, that 2-row barley that they're using in Europe.
I have been so struck in everything that I've seen, and I think it's a point that we should continue to make at how fast that happened. That it's easy to think, things moved much more slowly in the 1800s, but if you look at how quickly, number one, pale lager became a primary thing brewed throughout Europe and then England, and then how quickly it made its way into the United States through some major brewers, up in Wisconsin and St. Louis and others. Even when I was in Prague a couple of years ago for the Czech Trade Mission, in the Hop Museum in Žatec, you see paintings in that museum in Žatec from the late 1850s that are, referencing American brewers and, these, using their hops and some of the, advertising and marketing. And so that connection, it happened very, very fast, and there was much more, flow, even despite how challenging travel was in the 1800s on ships and everything else. It was happening. It was happening, at a pace that, even then would have seemed pretty remarkable. We see change now and think, the last 15 years of beer were kind of crazy. But you had 15 years where beer became kind of crazy even in that era of the 1800s.
Yeah, you're spot on, Jamie. And it kind of breaks my heart that George Washington, his brewer Andrew Wales, and an enslaved man named Wilkes, Wilkes dies in 1770. Ironically, George Washington and Andrew Wales die in 1799, about half a century before we get to 1842. It breaks my heart. They never get to try the golden beer from Pilsen. But that being said, I think there's cultural importance outside of technological importance, right? And even though I know I said the 18th century has very little to do with how we envision brewing today, one truth or one maxim that I think Pete and I stand by is a brewer always wants to make their best beer. Every man, woman, or child, in some cases, going back to the 18th century, wanted to put forward the best product possible, even if the market was not the market we know it today. No Apple Pay, no Venmo, right? That being said, I think it's really important to have these cultural touchstones. We know an enslaved blind man named Wilkes died because of accidents sustained in Wales Brewery. So we know that Black Hands have been in the first commercial brewery in DC. And just last weekend, we had the grand opening of our first Black woman-owned brewery, brick and mortar in DC. So that felt like a full circle moment in many ways. But to your point, I'm very proud of my Czech heritage. My father was born in Prague. Interestingly enough, there's a great writer in Prague. His name's Evan Rail. He writes, you can find him all over the place and find his books. But
Evan, he's okay.
He's all right.
He's okay.
He's all right. You may have crossed paths when you were in the Czech with him. But he mentioned that. But
we've talked about ska music together. Even
there you go.
Yeah, he's kind of a fan.
But he mentions that by 1907, Pilsner Urquell, and the famed brewery that Joseph Grohl got his start, started out. By 1907, they have an 11 degree, a 12 degree, and a 13 degree. Mind you, this is 160 years after Hannah Glass's small, middling, and strong beer. And not to say 13 Plato is strong, 12 is middling, and 11 is small, but there are some things that are just evergreen in brewing that no matter how far we get from, our ancestors in the 18th century, some things remain the same. And culture is, of course, one of those huge things, especially beer culture.
I'd like to focus on one aspect you highlighted, which was sort of the transatlantic nature of these brewing experiences and knowledge. And so in Washington, D.C., we have really worked quite a bit with the Heinrich House Museum and bringing back beer from the Christian Heinrich Brewing Company. That was Washington, D.C.'s largest brewery back in the 19th and 20th century. Their brewery was actually where the Kennedy Center is now located up until until 1956. And so Christian Heinrich, he was actually like the Guinness Book World Record holder for
We can call it the Kennedy Center, right? It's the Kennedy Center
Correct.
again?
That's right.
Okay.
His brewery was where the Kennedy Center is today. Yes.
Yeah.
And he was a brewer, literally still working on the floor until he was 102. So he really did span this whole history of the rise of his immigrant one-person operations through the massive beer barons era up until Prohibition and then after. But Christian actually worked, so he grew up in Germany and worked, first for his family butcher shop and then various breweries, including Anton Dreyer's brewery in Austria, which was one of the breweries making some of the most advanced beer, Vienna lagers of its day and highest quality, and doing some of the, deepest scientific work on brewing science. So he kind of brought some of that brewing knowledge back to the United States, settling in Baltimore, then eventually opening up his own brewery in Washington, D.C. But he would go back to Germany pretty much every summer and continue to kind of keep up with brewing practice in Europe as well as, in the United States. So I think that intercontinental thing was really interesting in how they were bringing that knowledge. But even though he's working with brewers in Germany who are using, two-row barley, he's still doing the American practice of using six-row and corn in his beer.
Yeah, Pete, that's a really good point. So Heinrich, DC's biggest brewer, was at the Dreyer Brewery in Vienna. So the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to the capital of the U.S. And Heinrich at one point was brewing over between 100,000 and 200,000 barrels. Our biggest brewery in DC proper today is Other Half. They're brewing about 30,000 barrels. Will they get there? We'll see. But the point is, that is one man's know-how from, the famed Vienna lager, the originators of the Vienna lager, Anton Dreyer and his breweries, to the U.S., specifically DC. And it's fascinating that because it's like, oh, where do we draw the line? How did that get here? He worked there. He was at one point the head of the cellar in Vienna. But thanks to the archives, getting back to the archives, Pete and I saw, sales receipts for corn and rice. And when we read some of the earlier lager brewing books like George Fix and some of the stuff that came out in the 90s or 80s, 1990s, it's like, oh, brewers either use corn or rice. Well, here the archives tell us, in fact, he was using whatever he could get his hands on, because he was growing from, a 500-barrel brewery to nearly a 250,000-barrel brewery by the time of his death at 102 years old.
There's an interesting piece here, and what we're talking about, I think, is fascinating. When I had a great conversation with Greg Casey, who has written, a beautiful series of books on American brewing history, and he made this point also that we historically have thought of the influence as passing from Europe to the U.S., but in fact, through the 1800s and early 1900s, it was a very two-way street, that there was work being done by brewers in the United States that was being done concurrently with that in Europe, and the influence was passing back and forth. It was, it was not U.S. brewers are taking from these European brewers. It was very literally going in both of those directions. And so, and I think it's important for us to think about that context today, because I think the same thing is happening at an international scale across the entire world. today, because we have channels like this and others where this information can flow in all of these directions, and that that it wasn't just a single direction kind of influence. But again, I want to, I think it'd be fun, looking back at some of your historical work. Are there some kind of early 1800s or late 1700s beers that you all have come across that you think are, have some particularly interesting examples of American ingenuity or local ingredients, or, that have pulled in some of these things that kind of speak to that early American, early United States experience that are interesting, in addition to obviously persimmon, some other kinds of approaches that you've historically seen that say, this kind of American ingenuity around brewing is something that, while we have seen it in this era from the 1970s of craft through the present in this particular 20-teens era of incredible innovation and interest, but that it actually, this is something that is fundamentally human and American that goes back, even to these earliest days of brewing?
That's a great question. Pete, do you want to go first?
I'm stumping you. Sorry, throwing us off script here.
I mean, that kind of immediately makes me think of, as we look at the beers that were available, the 19th century had thousands and thousands of breweries. And so we kind of think of styles now as being, you have the IPAs and you have your amber lager and you have this and that. Back then, there wasn't really that style. It was like, I make Pete's beer, and this is the beer I make. And so the diversity of beers back then, I think, really surprises people when, it surprises me when I go and see the wide variety of things, like just crazy, like beers. Like we found this like 1930s beer that was like 8%. Right, Mike? In an era when they were like, it was like an 8% kind of like strong ale that they were making at a brewery that was otherwise making like 4% lager, and all sorts of other just surprising styles of beer and unique ingredients. So the one beer we have made comes from Eliza Smith's cookbook. That was the first cookbook published in the United States. And her recipe for strong ale includes actually rosemary flowers. And so that was a beer that we made with Mount Vernon. A little bit polarizing. I was a fan. Mike was less of a fan of the using rosemary as a bittering agent in addition to hops.
But
I think
beer guy.
Yeah.
I'm a beer guy, Pete, not an ale man. That rosemary ale. Yeah,
I thought it was nice and floral.
It was good. Was it great? That's for the drinker to decide. Pete, I'll tag on to your strong beer point. So Jamie, getting back to your question, one thing to me is really sort of how diversified America's brewing styles have been. So Pete and I have another beer historian friend, Doug Hoverson, and I was like, Doug, we found this label that says 12%. Is that true? He was like, oh yeah, there was not one, but two Wisconsin breweries in the 1930s making 12% beer. And Pete and I were just like, phew. And then a fun little tidbit, Pete was actually born in Florida, and Florida had the Spearman Brewery, and the Spearman Brewery made a beer called Straight 8. And we come to find out that they were brewing an 8% beer, which, as anybody who's ever been to Florida knows, is not the ideal climate for an 8% beer in the 1930s, but was that a progenitor to the famed Florida pastry stout? It's kind of like what's old is new again at some point in history, right? Cycles of things. And so I think, our desire to make a really strong beer is always an interesting one. One sort of historic thing, which we didn't find a lot of precedent for, is the double mash beer. So we brewed a Bristol export because we knew George Washington was getting kegs from Bristol. And we were like, oh, Bristol export. So Pete found it's called the Town and Country Brewer. You mash in, take your first runnings as grain out, take your first runnings as liquor for a brand new mash that you just milled in. And that beer was long and hot and sweaty. We made the mistake of brewing it in, DC metro region in August. but we effectively made a strong October beer. And it was great because it had this incredible malt depth, but it was a smash beer. You know, we only used a single malt and a single hop, and it had this incredible complex flavor depth to it. And so I don't know, I love that one. You know, another favorite one is Kulmbacher, which is, of course, after the German town of Kulmbach. But we found out American brewers were brewing it with corn. And then some American brewers like Blatz had a 4% ABV one. Some brewers out east were brewing a 6% ABV one. So it was like one beer would have one name, but if you drank it in Wisconsin, you could have a dozen of them. If you're down in Manhattan, you probably know more than one or two. You know, it's like...
That's amazing. It's amazing. So this double mash beer you did was a more like a pale malt, but not a stout if it's a single malt beer.
Yeah, it was
That's correct.
Yeah, it wound up being 9%, and just great flavor depth. I can't remember if we used Maris Otter or Golden Promise, but I think we used English barleys on it. But we haven't done it with Virginia barleys yet. So there's another thing on the to-do list, you know?
Right there you go. You have this kind of, early approach to what now is a technique used by some, again, of those big barrel-aged stout makers making, 15% ABV stouts that they then throw into barrels. And, these same techniques are something that brewers have been using for hundreds and hundreds of years now. So, yeah.
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 Your mash tun is only so big. You can't double the size of your mash tun, but you can use twice as much of malt if you mash it twice.
Massively inefficient, and I hope even in those
inefficient.
I hope in the early days those guys had something else to do with that spent grain, because we would hate for all of that agricultural energy that was expended in growing that and processing that to just be tossed away with only 30-40% efficiency at the most off of something like that. What a shame. Can't waste that agricultural project.
Speaking of, I've got to give a shout out to Fabio Garcia at Dynasty, who does let us, gives us more carte blanche than we probably deserve, and these crazy 18th century and 19th century brewing practices.
Fabio's a great brewer. I'll echo Pete's statement and say that I think it was 2011, 2012, 2013 when Fabio brewed the first post-prohibition all Virginia ingredient beer. Virginia barleys, hops, water, and then yeast grown by Jasper Yeast, which is our local yeast whisperer here in Northern Virginia.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Well, as we wrap up here, any broad thoughts? I mean, you guys have done a lot of historical work on the history of brewing in the United States. It's the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States this year. That's obviously what we are celebrating tomorrow. And I'll say tomorrow as this comes out on July 3rd. Are there some big, broad thematic takeaways that you all have discovered through all of this historical work that you think kind of, thematically underpin, this whole project? America is a project, United States is a project, but brewing in the United States is also a project. Are there some of those principles you think that have kind of always survived through this kind of as a through line through this history of brewing in the United States?
The beer that we're releasing with Mount Vernon is called Common Country, and we took that name from George Washington's farewell address, where he says, citizens by birth or choice of a common country, you have in a common cause fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are a work of joint councils and joint efforts. And so I think it's speaking to the diversity of experiences that we have in America and bringing that together, under the same country. And so for this beer, we actually are hoping that and are, working with other brewers to brew this kind of around the country, this middling ale or this small beer that's in hand glasses, Art of Cookery, or the October beer. And so, we've got all three of those recipes available for any brewers who would like to brew that. And, our hope is that they do work with a local maltster, local hop growers. If there's some particular ingredient that would go particularly well with this beer, the New Mexico brewers can throw in some green chilies if they want. that's, I think, what makes our country great is this diversity of experience that we do have in this huge country. And the pride of a beer can, kind of show our local pride and our, particular city. We obviously are in Washington, D.C. and have brewed Senate beer with Bright Proper. That's, Christian Heinrich's original brand. And it's just amazing to see, people drinking Stennett at Nats baseball games. It's a truly Washington, D.C. beer. And I think other historical beers in other cities and other states can kind of similarly bring that pride of and it's sort of awareness of history. So that's kind of my pitch of why I think you should try to brew one of these historical beers using your own local experience and ingredients.
Yeah, well said, Pete. Jamie, I'd give you advice which actually came from an early episode with some of your favorite brewers in Germany and Belgium. Befriend your hop grower, right? I would say befriend your local librarian, befriend your local archivist, because they might say, I forgot, but there was a brewer here in the 19th century and we actually have their notebook, like shake the tree because things will come out of it. Befriend your archivist the way you'd befriend your hop grower. Just dovetailing off Pete's comment, I have here in my hand a beer called Dahl's Garden. And this is a beer that came from Funky Town in Chicago. And it's a collab with one of our local black-owned breweries in DC, Soul Mega. They called it Dahl's Garden because Dahl was a woman who was enslaved at Mount Vernon and came to Mount Vernon with Martha Washington. I'll say history, while it doesn't repeat, it rhymes. 2 summers ago at Mount Vernon, they were doing an HVAC project. So they ripped out the HVAC in the mansion house and they discovered pits. In these pits were over 35 bottles of cherries and gooseberries and all these preserves. And thanks to Mount Vernon preserving the letters of Martha Washington, we know Martha Washington's leaving Philly to come back to Mount Vernon because the capital's in Philadelphia. Then she says, please preserve some fresh fruits. I know Dahl will remember how to do this. So we know that thanks to the skilled labor of enslaved peoples and so many folks in those early days of what would become America, the U.S., the early American Republic, we have to honor them. We have to keep telling their stories, right? We've talked about a lot of folks who are no longer in this world, but they shine down upon us, and we would encourage you to work locally and do well to honor our rich and long history.
That history and that origin story is as diverse as the country is itself, and that is a great place to bring it to a close. G&D's Elite 290 Micro Series is built for brewers who care about sustainability and performance. Berkeley Yeast's Fresh Chico is now available dry. PacTex handles are made from 100% recycled plastic and are fully recyclable. Indie Hop's Lorient has found its way into the hearts of lager lovers across the country. The Midea 50/50 Flex can convert to all fridge, all freezer, or half and half with just the touch of a button. Check out why so many craft brewers trust Brees for their specialty malt, and learn more about how Haas is growing the future of brewing at johnihaas.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button. Over the past 13 years, we have worked hard to bring you great stories about brewing from some of the best writers in the business, including Mike here from time to time. And, we want to keep bringing you these great stories over and over again. And it's your subscriptions that help support us in doing that. Lord knows that advertising does not pay all of our bills these days, as you could probably figure, because, social media companies have just taken so much of that out of the equation that it doesn't fund content in the way it once did. And for whatever that means that we rely on your direct support to bring you this, but it also means that you are who we focus all of our attention on. Pete, Mike, if you want to learn more about Lost Lagers and the work that you all are doing and some of these cool beer projects that you work on, where can they learn more about you all? Sorry, Lost Lagers and Extinct Ales.
Right.
I'm not getting your branding perfectly correct here.
Well, you can get in touch directly with us by emailing us info@lostlagers.com. And then across social media platforms, we are at Lost Lagers. I strongly encourage people to subscribe to Craft Beer and Brewing. Pete and I both subscribe. And we have a recipe that will be published thanks to your compatriot, Joe. So you can check out Craft Beer and Brewing to see common country recipes.
There you go. Appreciate your perspective on the history of brewing in the United States. Happy birthday, USA. Pete, Mike, cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks, Jamie.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.